so feel free to shoot me a thought on LinkedIn if you have a thought and want to kind of chat things through. Very much blue sky thinker in terms of kind of, what if, where can we go from there? Also, like Julia, super passionate about kind of the not-for-profit sector. I'm a chair of a board for an organization called Reaching Our Outdoor Friends that's working towards youth homelessness in the kind of west of Toronto and the Kitchener-Waterloo region. My background, I was a bit of a mutt. I started in software engineering, went into law and policy, and kind of landed in HR by accident. But I've worked in talent, I've worked in analytics, and I've worked in technology as well, more on the data engineering side. So that's me in a nutshell. Manulife, you may have heard of it. We are one of the largest, or the largest insurer in Canada. We help people make decisions easier and lives better. So really kind of an insurance and wealth footprint there. We're about 35,000 employees. It's a multinational, so we have operations in North America, in Asia, in the EU, as well as kind of pockets here and there. We're about 26 million customers globally, 1.1 trillion assets under management. And this is something that really makes me happy. And when you think about what an insurance company is supposed to do, this was last year's data, but we paid out $27.6 billion in payments, which is really, helping people through a tough time, which is great. So that's about me, about Manulife. What I want to cover tonight is really starting with what is workforce planning. Then I'm going to talk about what I'm super passionate about that nobody really likes to talk about, which is really building the foundation to get to good analytics. And the fact that you can't do it alone, just some tips on keeping it simple. And then finally, a couple of use cases or tidbits, because I know that people are always interested in kind of fun findings there. So what is workforce planning? And this will kind of make you chuckle. This is just a subset of what it could be. Workforce planning is really a subset of people analytics, and it can be any number of things. This is the way that we're starting to think about it at Manulife. It's really around cost fit of this whole concept of a closed loop system. It's looking at skills of the future. It's looking at what are your value creation or your critical roles. It's looking at organizational design. It's looking at traditional headcount planning. It's looking at location and site strategy. We have a bit of an asterisk here on challenge offering. So if you have a business kind of workforce challenge, we're happy to kind of take that on and solve that problem with data. So this is really where we started. I started with the technology function. They were kind of the most advanced, or we got them to be the most advanced. So really that's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today, is setting the foundation for doing some of this stuff really well. So the building blocks. You might be wondering, especially if you're a smaller company, where do I start? And I think the best place to start is really, with a case study. So in terms of that case study, what I really want to talk about is the importance of the business problem that you're starting with. And it really does have to be kind of executive driven. So you really need that buy-in from the top, because analytics, contrary to popular belief, may not be cheap. And you may have to do a lot of work to kind of set the stage. So you can always start with what you have, but to really get to where you want to be, you really need to start with the end in mind, which often requires kind of that executive buy-in to really push things forward, as well as the executive buy-in to really accelerate your solution coming out the other end, because that action piece coming out of the analysis is just as important as having a good hypothesis. So we were lucky enough to have a CEO that really thinks of our company much more as a technology company than a traditional financial services or insurance company, which is fantastic for us. So what does that mean? It means that what has made us successful in the past will not sustain us going forward. So we're a company that's been around for more than a century. We had the presence of Sir John A. Macdonald as our first CEO, which was fantastic for those of you in Canada. You'll know him if you're from outside of Canada. He was one of our prime ministers. Really what comes with that is, we have a great legacy, but we also have a lot of baggage. So in terms of what this looks like, it was really looking at a lot of our baggage. In technology alone, we had about 5,000 people and 1,700 different unique and beautiful job titles, which if you think about that from an analytics perspective, it's really hard to do analytics or segmentation when there's 1,700 different kind of unique and beautiful snowflakes. So what we ended up doing with that buy-in kind of right from the top was really investing and building out a proper career framework. What that means is we took those 1,700 different job titles and we boiled them down into 40 plus jobs. What that let us do is it really let us start to think about how do we plan for the future from an L&D perspective? How do we plan for the future in terms of a workforce site strategy, in terms of a workforce management plan, in terms of an onshore versus offshore strategy? What does all of that look like? Really, those 40 plus different jobs have enabled us to really take a good, hard, long look at that and realize some real savings to the business. So why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because it's not easy. It's not cheap, and it requires buy-in. In terms of our particular use case, and Jared, if you were able to be in the breakout session with him, he was actually part of this process when he was at Manulife. And actually, it was a big undertaking. For us to put the career framework, we actually mapped those 5,000 people into those 40 different jobs. And we went manager by manager, individual by individual, and put them into these new jobs. So from a buy-in perspective and an executive support perspective, it took us probably 8 or 9 months to go through that process. So, that was 5,000 plus employees. It was a squad of us actually flew around Asia for about 2.5 weeks. It was 55 plus hours in the air. 47 different sessions of mapping employees across 13 countries. Over 6 months was the implementation. It was about a 3-month prep work period. And really it was one team. So we worked with a consulting house, but we also had kind of a dedicated couple of us that sat within the enterprise and really kind of worked through that. And all of this really comes down to the fact that you really need that enabled kind of, stereotypical seat at the table. And that seat at the table is really from not just the executive table, but also from the stakeholder table. So you really can't get anything done without IT. So, you need to make sure that you're really dialed into kind of all the different advocacy groups across the enterprise as well. So why do we need a seat at the table? It really comes down to a couple of different things, and they're, some of the building blocks for analytics. It's starting with the context and building the problem and the context around it. So, if somebody comes to you with a hypothesis or an analytics question, it's really easy to miss the mark if you don't have proper context on why they're asking that question. So you kind of need to delve a little bit deeper and, back to the similar principle, ask why 5 times, kind of take it back to your childhood. And that's a really good way to kind of get at the core of what that is. You need input into the processes. So like I said at the beginning, if you don't design with the end state data in mind, you're going to miss the mark. So it's really important to take that step back and really make sure that you have input into the processes for what you're trying to accomplish at the end. So if you're designing new KPIs, weigh in at the start to make sure that you don't just get a KPI definition at the end, because it's going to make your life miserable to try to collect that data going forward. It's creating a shared interest and partnership. So again, 95% of analytics is really about that taking action at the end. And ultimately what that relies on is that shared interest and partnership. You can't change the world by yourself. You can provide the evidence, but ultimately it's going to be the executive team that really owns it and kind of drives it forward. And ultimately, similar to the business process, work on that foundation, build that foundation, and look to build it in scalable ways. So, if you have the opportunity to build something right now that's going to serve you, 3 to 5 years into the future, but it's going to take a little bit longer, you really need to advocate for that approach. So the foundation. If you're an analytics professional, I'm sure this is not news to you. If you're an HR professional, it might be. It's really about building the foundation, because from a segmentation standpoint, that's really where the crux of machine learning comes in. You need to build meaningful differences between employees to be able to tell the story. A good example of this I always use is looking at gender data. There's actually more differences in the female demographic than there is between males and females. So looking at it from a binary 1 or a 0 gender lens is not a great use of analytics. You actually need to get a little bit deeper than that. You need to look at things like skills, like competencies. You can use the demographic data from your core HRIS, but it's really about kind of creating those personas across the board and looking for meaningful ways that you can actually influence the behavior. Again, it's about driving action. So from a behavior change perspective, you're probably not going to change, a massive amount of people's gender, but in terms of how they interact with a specific system or a specific process, that's actionable. So that's really, if you're looking for big wins, that's a great spot to kind of focus. Is where you can alter behaviors. And it's all about, kind of that team mentality. So next up, I just want to talk about kind of what data science is and what it's not. Data science is not flashy. It's messy, it's ugly, and we spend a lot of time looking at suboptimal data. Most of the world thinks we push a button and out comes, your fancy finding. That's not really how it works. Analytics is about helping us organize chaos. So it's about taking a step back and being able to see the trend in the data. That's what we do as analytics professionals. I wanted to take another step back and really talk about roles in analytics next, and my perception on this. A lot of organizations think that one person can do all of this. If you can find somebody that does all of that, hire them, because they're kind of that purple unicorn. What I'll suggest is that there's skills in the marketplace that you can build and skills that you can buy, and some are more prone to each. So from this perspective, and again, back to that action-driven narrative that I'm kind of building on here, that data translator piece is absolutely critical. So being able to take your findings and translate them into a business context with an actionable outcome is absolutely critical to have that skill internally from a consulting angle. The data scientist, data engineering, you can supplement that a little bit. It's great if you have them in-house, but you can supplement those with vendor. The bottom piece really around kind of the architecture, the IO psychology, and really the data visualization capabilities, that's a great spot to buy, especially if you don't have scale from an enterprise perspective. So, there's a lot of vendors in this space that can really help you get there, so you can focus on the important stuff, which is really that data translation piece. And then ultimately, just a couple of key takeaways for folks. It's all about keeping it simple. So looking at, one of my favorites, a Sankey diagram. Don't do this. Nobody can read that chart. Instead, put it into meaningful buckets. Make it so that somebody can see the story that you're trying to tell, and really simplify. Looking at kind of an employee sentiment use case. We're taking all of these different use cases, or employee comments. And one of the things that's great about this is from a Power BI perspective, I'll put it in my Microsoft plug now because it's free. You can download, an instance of it just for your own personal computer. And you're able to do word clouds very, very easily, or you can use an online system for word clouds. I wouldn't advocate that though, because your risk people probably won't love you. But Power BI is all locally hosted, so you can go to town on that. So rather than reading through a huge subset of comments, throw it in a word cloud. It's not great from kind of a natural language processing or a complexity perspective, but it gives you an idea of the themes that you need to look for and that you need to build towards. So this is a great spot to start, tokenizing and really understanding the different themes that come out of kind of some of your employee sentiment pieces. And ultimately, I'm going to finish off just with back to that action piece. So use what you learn. So why do your employees leave? We actually did a use case around this. And one of the biggest factors contributing to our attrition is commute time, which is not an HRIS variable, but easy enough to find out. We know where people work. We know where people live. Google has a fantastic API for putting the two together. We actually found, it leads to region that people would leave because they get burnt out from a commute. But from an analytics perspective, you're actually able to quantify that. So anything over kind of that 45-minute time frame, that was really our flip point from an attrition modeling perspective. So, when you look at that, what do you actually use that for? You might show this to an executive and they'll say, well, that's interesting. What you use it for is something like this. This is a heat map of where all of our employees work in live and work in the Boston area. What we were able to do with this is we were actually able to look at this from a site strategy perspective and say, here are our offices. We're looking to centralize. where does that make the most sense from a real estate footprint perspective? And you're able to have a really robust conversation around what that looks like from a talent engagement and attrition lens, which is a lens that most executives kind of aren't thinking about kind of in the top of mind, but you can really kind of bring that perspective forward. Another really good one, this one's kind of moot now in terms of the COVID situation, but in terms of should I work from home? It's about laying out the pros and cons and having people make their own decision. So one of the things that we found, employees who are on a remote work arrangement are actually 20% less likely of being promoted. And that's just kind of a top of mind thing, from a contextual standpoint. The answer is that it depends on the individual. So it's where you are in your career trajectory, where you want to be, and what's important to you from a life values perspective. So that might be an acceptable trade-off for you, or it might not. But it's ultimately, it's up to the individual to make that decision. So just some quick key takeaways, and then we can jump into Q&A. So it's a good long road. Most companies aren't there yet, but just take a bite-sized piece and start. You have to start somewhere. Don't run out and hire a data scientist. They won't fix your problems. They'll look at your data and say, I'm not really sure where to start. I've only worked in academic data sets. So really take the time and get the foundation right. Use what you find as quickly as you can and keep improving it. So get those findings out the door, get additional investment, get additional resources, and keep building on it. Find an advocate. So find an executive that's really kind of, likes to geek out on this stuff with you and bring them along for your journey. And ultimately start with the business problem. It's got to be rooted in dollars or people won't care.